For all of human existence, we have been wary on traveling into the earth. There's a primal instinct at the back of our minds, constantly whispering to us of a natural fear of what's hidden from the sky. Perhaps it stems from our ancestors, avoiding cave systems because they knew if they entered, they might become lost or come face to face with a ferocious adversary ready to drag them into the deep darkness. Whatever might be the case, perhaps it's best we avoid venturing into the world beneath our feet. There may be things down there that don't want us to intrude on their home. Welcome back to Moonlight Lore, everyone. As always, I'm your host, Jordan Hopkins. While walking down the sidewalk, do you ever wonder what that concrete barrier might be separating you from? You probably don't very often, to be honest. There's really not much going on down there. Although in Toronto, the citizens would have to disagree. Through the labyrinth of 3,700 kilometers of sanitary sewers and over 500,000 of connection lines, the maze of damp tunnels crisscrossing under Toronto's streets is its own dark world rarely ever seen by any humans. And it's this fact that creates ignorance. Some are perfectly content with not knowing what goes on down there, while others might find it fascinating. But those who do are certainly in the minority. However, they are usually the ones to investigate when something goes wrong. And it's up to these fearless men and women to venture into these dark tunnels, to do a job many of us would avoid like the plague. Of course, stories of what goes on in those narrow passageways typically doesn't reach the ears of the public very often. Usually, it takes a random citizen stumbling upon an old forgotten entrance to this dark underground setting for people to finally realize maybe there's more going on beneath our feet than we could ever have imagined. In the early 1910s to the early 1940s, rumors of creatures running amok through the New York sewers gripped the city with a wave of curiosity mixed with fear. Those creatures were alligators, small reptiles advertised in newspapers, then shipped from Florida with the intention of making exotic pets for children. As the legend went, when these small gators eventually grew out of their cute phase, they were harder to take care of, and then many found their way in the waterways and sewers, fully expected to fend for themselves in the unforgiving and unnatural environment that is the Big Apple. For those disposing of these poor pets, the most popular way to be rid of them was simply sentencing them to a horrible fate of being flushed down the toilet. Now, there's no doubt this was a real thing. Old newspaper clippings can still easily be found advertising live baby gators for less than $2 in the 1930s currency. It's more than a steal of a deal for an actual alligator, but it's completely inhumane. After news eventually got out that people were flushing their pets or abandoning them in the waterways that connected to the city's sewer system, the stories of people spotting these animals thriving and city workers being attacked spread incredibly fast. One of the more famous stories of alligators being present in the New York City sewers was that of when two boys managed to spot a supposed 8-foot-long gator in a storm drain and managed to lasso the reptile and drag it out into the open for all to see. The source of these elusive sewer gators is clear, but when we travel north to Toronto, there is a far stranger mystery lying in wait, just below the busy streets. When Toronto was first being established way back at the beginning of the 19th century, the Europeans settling this land found it to be populated by a series of streams and rivers breaking off from Lake Ontario that carved a path directly through the settlement and land they were on. The early settlers did their best to manage the waterways that helped move supplies to their small city, but even with the construction of small bridges and crossings, the network of flowing water eventually became congested with filth and carrying diseases. The solution to deal with this issue was to begin construction and expansion of the city as soon as possible. To combat the now contaminated and putrid waterways that flowed right through the developing city limits, the planners and workers decided it best to simply allow the water to continue to flow, but build the city on top of them. When the construction really took off, this added hundreds of man-made underground networks and tunnels to become present under the city, combining the already existing flowing streams and rivers with dark passageways void of any light. Fast forward to today, and the labyrinth under Toronto has grown exponentially, creating an environment completely void of any kind of life, or so people thought. Eventually, just like how rumors of alligators living in the New York sewer systems came to be the talk of the town there, so did too of whispers of something living under Toronto. Over the years, the urban legend of something lurking beneath the city has continued to grow to this day, to the point where even maintenance workers are sometimes scared to venture deep into those dark passageways. The year was 1979. Authors and writers at the Toronto Sun newspaper had their hands full with their weekly edition coming out, and were ready to begin writing up drafts for their next issue. But that's when they caught word from an anonymous source of a story that sent all other drafts into the trash bin. Writer/reporter Laurie Goldstein was deployed to an area of the city dubbed Cabbage Town, a lower-income neighborhood named after the Irish settlers who found their new life here to be more difficult than expected and resorted to growing cabbages in their front yards for food. When Laurie pulled up outside of an apartment complex on Parliament Street, she was hesitant on what she was getting herself into. She was told what to expect in terms of the story, but what she hadn't expected was the hesitancy of the man with the story. Sitting down with the quiet man in his early 50s, he only revealed his name to be Ernest and made it known he was not looking for any kind of recognition. He didn't want to even share his last name or allow it to be published in the papers, mainly to avoid any kind of ridicule that might come from sharing his story. And he was even quoted saying, "I wish you never came here," in response to the appearance of Laurie and her team. According to him, he and his wife Barbara had been caring for a small litter of kittens who were seemingly abandoned by their mother sometime last summer in August. The small Kindle were helpless and they were in pretty rough shape, but with the time Ernest and his wife put into caring for them, they created a bond and guided their little litter to health. One morning, however, Ernest had left his apartment with the intention of walking behind the building to leave some food for the kittens there. But when he arrived, he had found one of the members of his small group had suddenly disappeared. He quickly looked around, checking the immediate vicinity behind his apartment, but was disappointed to find the young kitten was nowhere to be seen. He believed, though, because the kittens were getting old enough to wander around on their own, perhaps this one had just stumbled a little further than it intended and simply gotten itself lost. While branching out, searching the alley behind and the one in between his building and the one next door, Ernest managed to stumble upon one of the old, forgotten entrances that he believed to have led down into the underground tunnel system. Standing in the nearly dilapidated entrance, Ernest was about to turn around and search somewhere else, but just as he did, he caught the faint cries of an animal in distress, emanating deep from within the dark. When he first gazed upon the dark opening, he had some serious reservations on entering the lost tunnel, but believing now his furry friend had gotten itself lost inside, he wasn't about to let it become abandoned once more. The moss-covered concrete hid the entrance well, and Ernest knew he wouldn't make it far without some kind of light source. It was nearly fully hidden, covered by the overgrown foliage and collapsed concrete. But now that he knew it was there, Ernest was able to return home, then back to it within just a couple minutes with his trusty flashlight. He flipped the switch and illuminated the brown, moss-covered stones inside, and taking one last deep breath of fresh air, he bent down and followed the small beam of light acting as his guide. Stumbling and slipping through the damp, rocky underground, hoping his quest would soon come to an end, Ernest found himself traveling much further than he anticipated he would have to, and the further he went, the tighter it got. Before he knew it, he was down on all fours, crawling on his hands and knees through the shallow water and on the hard rock floor of the tunnel. Through the stagnant, dirty water and stale air, and after crawling roughly about 10 feet into the tight, half-collapsed tunnel, he was finally able to get to an area where he was able to stand upright and stretch out his stiffened back. But as he did so and shone his flashlight forward to see where he was actually traveling to, that's when the beam illuminated a creature straight out of his worst nightmares. Hunched over facing away from him was what Ernest described as being a 3-foot-tall, gaunt, humanoid creature with filthy gray hair. It was occupied by something it held in its hands that kept its attention and didn't immediately notice Ernest standing several feet behind it. Horrified at the scene before him, he froze still and tried to hold his breath for as long as he could, hoping whatever this monstrosity was before him wouldn't notice his presence just a few short feet away. It felt like he was standing there for an eternity, and eternity wreaked havoc on his strained lungs. Ernest was forced to let out his restrained breath, the echo of the noise bouncing down the old wet halls of the tunnel, landing directly in the ears of the creature, who now knew it was being watched. Spinning around with lightning speed and with slanted blood-red eyes, it glared at Ernest. With an intensity of pure anger, it stood up from its hunched-over position on 2 slim legs and hissed,
Get out! Get out!
And with unmatched speed, the creature broke contact and sprinted out of view down one of the side tunnels, leaving behind only the echo of its small footsteps running in the shallow water, and a trembling, wide-eyed Ernest behind. After crawling out of the tunnel as fast as his body would allow, Ernest abandoned all hope of trying to find his lost cat. He had the sneaking suspicion he knew what had happened to it, and didn't want to meet the same end. Rushing back to his apartment, he slammed the door shut behind him and immediately ran to the sink to wash his face, hoping the sudden splash of cold water would wake him up from this nightmare. Obviously, his wife Barbara instantly realized something was wrong with her husband and began asking him questions as to what happened. He didn't necessarily want to worry his wife, so Ernest stayed tightly lipped about his experience in the tunnel. But a concerned and attentive wife knows when her husband of 19 years is deeply troubled by something, and with a few sympathetic words of encouragement, she convinced Ernest to tell her what he had seen. With a deep sigh of defeat, he went into his short but horrifying story of what happened only moments before. He told her about the lost cat, the secret tunnel, the strange monster hiding in the dark, and every other detail he could remember in the moment. Just as he discussed with his wife, he told Lori, taking down his tale, that if the story was to get out and his identity revealed, that nobody would ever take him seriously again. He would be called a crank, a nutjob, and would likely be ridiculed by the public relentlessly. Ever since that summer back in 1978, he and his wife had only shared the story with a select few trusted friends and family. Of course, though, the two knew their secret had gotten out once Lori showed up on their doorstep asking questions. As it would seem, it only takes one set of loose lips for a story like this to instantly gain the attention of the news. After hearing his tale, Lori stared at him with a mixture of disbelief and concern. She wasn't fully convinced if what she was hearing was the truth, and was concerned for the man's mental state if he had simply imagined the whole thing. She pressed with more questions, hinting at the idea that perhaps Ernest had been drinking that day and found himself in that tunnel only to imagine a strange creature who spoke to him. Barbara then loudly chirped in and claimed while her husband does have the occasional drink like anyone else, he was not drinking on that particular day when he returned to the apartment visibly shaken. Seeing Ernest become visibly upset in recounting his tale, Lori finally asked him if he would be willing to take a walk with her down to where the entrance of the tunnel was, just to make sure it was actually there. Ernest, understandably, was a little hesitant on returning to that spot. Even with 7 months between the incident and being interviewed, it was obvious this experience was still firmly lodged in his mind. Lori, for one, loved the story, despite how unlikely it all seemed. She knew it was gold, and it was going to draw in a lot of readers, so she insisted, for authenticity's sake, that she had to see the supposed tunnel where this creature was said to live. With a bit of persuading, Lori found herself side by side with Ernest, leading her around the back of his apartment to where the old forgotten tunnel laid in wait for them. She was stunned to discover Ernest had been actually telling them the truth about the existence of this ominous entrance down to the last detail. But what stood out and even took Ernest by surprise was the discovery of a small, mangled body of a dead cat, half buried in the dirt just a few feet inside. Lori thanked Ernest and Barbara for their time and their interview, thanking them profusely for allowing her to print their incredibly intriguing story. She promised them, as per their wishes, only their first names would be released to the public in the story, and their last would be withheld. When Lori left their apartment, she was overwhelmed with thoughts and worry. It seemed Ernest was telling her the truth about the existence of the tunnel after all, and the discovery of the dead cat only added to the believability of it all. This was the story of the year, a horrid creature creeping through Toronto's tunnels, and she knew it would be something people would be talking about for years to come. When the news broke that a supposed monster was lurking deep within Toronto's sewers, it threw the city into a bit of a panic. Everyone was paranoid this thing was lying in wait under their feet, creeping out of the tunnels at night to hunt their pets or steal away unsuspecting children. Safety then became a major issue for the city. Whether or not this creature really existed was a discussion for another day, but it was the potential danger and liability of children or adults venturing into and becoming lost in the dark, disease-infested sewers that raised concern among city officials and workers. So, taking great care as to not to appear to confirm the existence of this monster living underground, a quiet campaign got underway of workers going out to seal the known openings to the tunnels, in hopes of keeping people out and keeping whatever unknown entity inside in. When reporters at the Toronto Sun, namely Lori, discovered that workers were going around closing up entrances, she tracked down a few of them and began to question if they had ever seen or heard anything strange happening underground. Instead of scoffing or dismissing their questions like she expected, the workers remained serious. One was quoted saying, "People working on the surface just don't know what it's like down there. It's a whole different world. Who would have thought a few years ago that people would live in the sewers, and yet that's exactly what they found in New York a few years back." Another worker stepped in and was quoted saying, "I don't know what Ernest saw down there, but I'll tell you one thing. If we could get in there, I sure as hell wouldn't want to go down alone." While several entrances to the tunnels are cleared, inspected, and open to the public for small historical tours today, most are either still hidden from the public eye, sealed shut, or specifically left open only for maintenance workers to venture in and out of. And years after the event, there has been incredible speculation as to what Ernest had actually come across down there. While many people, maintenance workers included, believe what he saw was nothing more than just maybe a beaver or a stray raccoon who found themselves trapped down there are some on the other side of the fence who fully believe what he witnessed was an elusive cryptid of some kind. There have been points made for a very long time that those less fortunate in our society had made the large open sewer system under Toronto their home. For decades, police and workers have had to be called out to remove these people because of the obvious dangers that come with living in a sewer system. These unfortunate souls, who have found they have no home to call their own, have oftentimes called the large passageways under the city a safe haven, a place to shield them from the harsh Canadian winters and the eye of the public who oftentimes look down upon them. While a human living in the sewer could be the case, the description Ernest gave of the creature he saw doesn't necessarily convince many that it was definitely a human. The blood-red glowing eyes, the gaunt horrifying slim body, the gray fur, and weighing in at what Ernest estimated was 30 pounds along with being only 3 feet tall. All of these details would be incredibly hard to mistake if it really was a human being. No human really looks like that. So a homeless person hiding in the dark tunnel is likely not the answer we are looking for. But nor does an animal. While many animals could call the deep dark sewers their home as well, and could potentially match some of the details Ernest described, it too falls flat. Yes, animals like raccoons can have gray hair, reflective eyes, and stand on 2 legs and also walk fairly fast while standing on those 2 legs. It doesn't explain the voice. Now, perhaps Ernest was simply just terrified and he had imagined a few details wrong. It was dark enough for the need of a flashlight, according to him. So perhaps if it wasn't a great flashlight, all he may have seen in the dark tunnel was the figure, and not the defining details of a raccoon everyone could recognize. But Ernest wanted to make it clear that it did hiss at him, and it said for him to get out twice. It could be a possibility that if it really was a raccoon, that it did indeed hiss at him, and the echo bouncing off the walls along with the already scared state he was in, caused him to interpret the hissing to sound like the words, "Get out." This may be a little bit of a stretch, but it is certainly a possibility. I don't want to say Ernest was lying per se, but maybe it was all just a case of mistaken identification mixed with the adrenaline of fear. That being said, after the closing and sealing of many of the known tunnel entrances, there have been little to no sightings of the same creature since. This could be chalked up to the fact that with many of the entrances being closed, people wandering into the tunnels doesn't really happen as often, and nobody really wants to do a deep dive into Toronto's sewer system in search of a monster, leaving whatever creature is actually down there to roam freely without any further interruptions. This then leads me to my next interesting piece of information. Long prior to the establishing of the city, the ancient Ojibwe people traveled and lived all throughout different areas of Canada and the United States, notably the very same land Toronto is now standing on. The Ojibwe natives have shared stories for centuries about mythological spirits and creatures who they've held dear and respected, as well as sometimes feared. The Memagwesi being one of them. These small, playful spirits were often said to enjoy playing pranks on unsuspecting humans, and depending on certain circumstances, they were considered to be either good or bad. Sometimes they were known to steal items belonging to humans, or if granted gifts such as tobacco by a compassionate human, they would, in return, leave behind their own gift as a sign of thanks. What most people find interesting about them is that the Memagwesi share the near exact same characteristics as the creature spotted by Ernest back in 1978 in the tunnel. They are said to have small, child-sized bodies, covered in hair, large heads with narrow faces, and an absent nose, as well as having a strange, hissing voice, similar to that to the sound of a dragonfly flying. The description matches almost exactly to what Ernest saw. But how would one of these ancient spirits find themselves in an abandoned dirty tunnel under Toronto? That answer might actually be simpler than one would believe. Not only are these small hairy creatures said to live in the southern Ontario region, but more specifically on the very land where Toronto was built. You see, Native American folklore tells us the spirits typically have a certain domain they live in, an environment they thrive in, so to speak. The Memagwesi are said to be water spirits, said to live near the small riverbanks, carving symbols into stones and guiding canoes off course. Now remember back to the beginning of the episode. Toronto was literally built on top of several rivers and streams that flowed out from Lake Ontario. The man-made tunnels under the city all converging into one another and allowing the passage of water to flow freely through the underground caverns. If the legends are true and that the Memagwesi once lived on the land and in the rivers where the great city of Toronto now stands, perhaps they're still there, running freely through the tunnels, causing mischief and scaring people who enter their underground domain. The sheer vastness of dark tunnels stretching across all of Toronto is an eerie, mysterious place rarely ever visited by humans. Perhaps while we humans live our ordinary lives out on the surface, there's much more going on beneath our feet than we care to think about. Whatever Ernest saw that summer day back in 1978, it didn't seem to have been a human or animal. So perhaps it was a long-forgotten creature, a creature only a few are aware of, lying in wait for that next unsuspecting victim to become lost in their damp, dark world. Thank you all for listening to the Moonlight Lore podcast. As always, I hope you enjoyed listening to the episode. For those of you who don't know already, if you are looking to support the show, the absolute best way you can do that is by donating to the Patreon. For as little as $5 a month, the cost of 1 or 2 coffees, you can help the show grow into something truly magical. Signing up is incredibly easy to do, and anyone who does choose to donate will gain access to monthly bonus episodes, along with other bonuses depending on what tier you select. There are already 2 full episodes on there right now, and definitely much more to come. Your support on Patreon goes a long way in helping cover the costs like website fees, hosting fees, editing software costs, and all that stuff that comes with producing a podcast. But I know money can be tight for some people, so I completely understand if you can't donate at this time. But if you still want to show support, leaving a 5-star review on iTunes or Spotify or whatever app you're listening on goes a long way in showing people that this content is worth listening to. It only takes a second and you never have to do it again. If you have a horrifying story you've been dying to share, but have no one else to share it with, my ears are always open. Feel free to send me an email or message on Twitter or Instagram, and all of those can be found by going to moonlightlore.com, a one-stop shop for everything relating to the podcast. A place where you can see pictures, all the episodes, updates, information about the show and yours truly, and of course all the ways you can contact me. I hope to see you there. At the moment, I don't believe I have any news coming up, but if I do, I'll keep you all posted on the website or on Twitter, of course. But until next time, you guys, thank you so much again for listening, and stay safe, take care, and I hope you have a good day. Or night. Or both, I guess. Whatever, see you next time.